Night split open above the ruined bridge as the river roared like a beast caged by moonlight. The narrator said, Orion Vale ran, carrying a choice that burned him from the inside. Elena Hart said, do not leave me to their spell. Orion hissed that love was a trap that would end them both. The narrator said, steel rang as masked hunters closed in, eyes bright with cold magic. Elena trembled, yet she did not step back from the edge. Orion said, I swore never to love. The vow shook loose as a sigil flared on his skin. The narrator said, the spell wanted obedience, not mercy. Elena said, then break it for me. The bridge groaned. The river leapt. Orion turned, torn between power and the person before him. The narrator said, some promises are cages, and some cages are keys. The narrator said, dawn limped into the valley, peeled thin by smoke and fear. Orion paced the shattered chapel and tried to bury the spark that Elena had lit. Elena said, you are not a curse. He said the vow kept him alive when love tried to kill him. The narrator said, Mara traced a ward along the broken altar and listened to a storm only she could hear. Jax rattled jokes until his hands steadied. Elena said, tell me why the sigil burns. Orion said that it punished mercy. The narrator said some magics do not guard the heart, they guard the chains on it. Elena held his gaze, and the room felt less ruined. The narrator said, they crossed the market ruins where banners hung like wet tongues of color. Jack said, if doom is coming, can it wait until lunch? Orion smiled despite himself, and Elena noticed the slip. The narrator said, a hummingbird of hope hovered there, small and stubborn. Mara warned that Calder would test their bonds, not their blades. Elena said, then let him see we do not break. Orion touched the sigil and winced. The narrator said, pain is a tutor that steals its pay and scars. Jack said, I prefer tutors with cookies. The road bent toward secrets. The narrator said, they reached the willow gate where the world thinned to whispering threads. Mara said the roots remembered old oaths. Orion said oaths had teeth. Elena touched the bark and felt a throb like a distant drum. The narrator said, Calder's spies watched from the seam between leaf and light. Jack said, I hate seams. A shadow sighed. Ronan stepped out and met Orion's stare like a knife meeting flint. The narrator said, history bent in his silence. Ronan said, turn back before your heart is used against you. The leaves shook. The narrator said, night remade the path in iron blues and wolf breath. Ronan said, Calder wanted a bond broken by terror, not by truth. Orion said, you chose him. Ronan flinched. Elena said, what does he fear? Ronan said Calder feared a heart that would not obey a command. The narrator said, Mara weighed silence against mercy and chose a dangerous kindness. Jack said, if we are bait, at least we bite. The wind carried bells from a drowned town. The narrator said, Orion walked beside Elena, and the vow frayed one thread more. The narrator said, the road curved toward the shattered watchtower where dawn broke in bruised gold. Orion Vale felt the sigil pulse, like a chain tugging his marrow. Elena Hart said, you fear the bond because you feel it growing. He snapped that fear was the one thing keeping them alive. The narrator said Jack's reed lingered near, light words hiding the way his eyes scanned every shadow. Mara Gray said, magic binds where trust frays, and Calder knows this well. Ronan Black moved with them, silent as a ghost, his loyalty still uncertain. Elena touched Orion's arm and said, your vow is not a shield, it is a wound. The narrator said, the tower loomed, and with it the weight of truths not yet spoken. The narrator said, beyond the tower, the forest thickened into a labyrinth where whispers bled from bark. Orion Vale said the trees were marked with Calder's curse. Elena Hart said, then we burn no path. We walk as if unseen. Mara Gray said, not unseen but unclaimed. Jax Reed muttered that curses had no sense of humor. The narrator said, Ronan Black brushed his hand along a tree, and the scarlet glow of runes lit the grove like veins of fire. Orion hissed, that mark feeds on my bloodline. Elena said, then you are the key to undoing it. The forest pressed in, demanding choices. The narrator said, at the heart of the grove lay a circle of stone where shadows pulsed with voices not their own. Mara Gray said, this is the Echo Well. Orion Vale stepped forward, sigil blazing, and the whispers rose. Elena Hart said, do not let it take you. Orion said, it already knows me. The narrator said, Jax Reed tried to speak a jest, but swallowed it when the ground shivered. Ronan Black said every choice leads to death. The narrator said, Orion's knees buckled, but Elena's hand steadied him, her gaze a tether stronger than chains. The narrator said, nightfall spread across the grove with the swiftness of spilled ink. Orion Vale said they should leave before Calder struck. Elena Hart said, running gives him victory. Mara Gray said he does not seek your death, he seeks your surrender. Jax Reed said then he is shopping in the wrong market. The narrator said a shadow split from the dark and Lord Calder himself stepped forward, silver mask catching torchlight. Calder said, you waste your power on love when you could rule beside me. The narrator said, the grove hushed, as if awaiting Orion's reply. The narrator said, tension cracked the night like ice splitting beneath weight. Orion Vale said, I would rather burn than bend. Calder's voice curled like smoke as he said, then burn with her. Elena Hart stepped closer to Orion and said, if love is fire, then I choose the flame. Mara Gray whispered a word beneath her breath. The narrator said, Jax Reed raised his weapon, though fear trembled his hand. Ronan Black's jaw tightened as if torn by two loyalties. The narrator said, the forest shook, and the first strike of destiny fell unseen. The narrator said, the storm broke over the cliffs as the party staggered into a cavern scarred by ancient battles. Orion Vale pressed his glowing forearm against cold stone. Elena Hart said, you cannot fight what is inside you if you keep running. Orion whispered that every step drew him closer to destruction. The narrator said, Mara Gray leaned on her staff, eyes drawn to carvings that foretold chains binding lovers in flame. Jax Reed said, that is not a bedtime story I would tell. Ronan Black stared into the dark and muttered, it already happened once. The narrator said the cave echoed with a truth too heavy to ignore. The narrator said they pressed deeper into the cavern where water dripped like the heartbeat of stone. Mara Gray said, this well remembers every oath broken here. Jax Reed whispered that echoes carried lies longer than truth. Orion Vale, said Calder, wants me hollowed out. Elena Hart touched his arm and said, you are not hollow, you are burning alive. The narrator said, Ronan Black leaned on a broken pillar, jaw tight as if he carried a wound older than the cave itself. The narrator said, in the silence, the weight of betrayal grew thick, waiting to reveal its teeth. The narrator said, from the cavern shadows stepped a figure once thought lost. The fallen hero Cale Arden said, you left me to the dark Orion. Orion Vale said, you chose the dark. The narrator said, Cale's eyes burned with grief and fury as he drew a blade etched with black veins. Elena Hart said, he was your brother in arms. Orion said, he was my brother in truth. Jax Reed muttered, and now he is our problem. Mara Gray whispered, a heart broken and twisted becomes the cruelest weapon. The narrator said, the cavern became a battlefield of memory. The narrator said, steel rang against steel as Cale Arden drove Orion Vale backward across slick stone. Elena Hart cried out, stop before this curse consumes you both. Orion said, this is not a duel, it is a reckoning. The narrator said, Mara Gray raised a shield of light that cracked under Cale's strike. Jax Reed said, if this is brotherly love, I'll stay an only child. Ronan Black shouted, He is not your enemy, Calder is. The narrator said. Cale's blade hesitated, trembling as if torn between hate and sorrow. The cavern shook with unspoken grief. The narrator said. Cale Arden fell to one knee, blade quivering as the curse rippled across his veins. Orion Vale said, "You were my brother." Cale said, "And now, I am your warning." Elena Hart said, "You can still be saved." Cale's laughter cracked with pain. The narrator said, Mara Gray whispered that some chains could not be undone without blood. Jax Reed lowered his weapon, muttering, "This is no victory." Ronan Black turned away, shadows tightening around him. The narrator said, the cavern's torches sputtered, and with them, hope dimmed into ash. The narrator said, the cavern opened into a shrine carved with mirrors that bent faces into strangers. Orion Vale said, this place knows me too well. Elena Hart whispered, or maybe it shows who you hide. Mara Gray said, the shrine of reflections reveals not what you want, but what you deny. Jax Reed muttered, if it shows me eating stew, I'll take it. The narrator said, in the mirrored stone, Orion saw himself bound in chains, yet the chains bled light like veins of fire. Ronan Black stepped forward and said, this is your truth, and it is the key Calder fears. The narrator said, the mirrors trembled as Calder's voice seeped from their surfaces like poisoned smoke. Calder said, you cannot escape what you are, Orion. You are the vessel I forged. Orion Vale roared, I am no one's weapon. Elena Hart stepped closer and said, if you were forged, then let love temper you. Mara Gray whispered that the mirrors spoke of binding magic older than kingdoms. Jax Reed muttered, old magic, new problems. The narrator said, the shrine pulsed, runes blazing like stars collapsing, and with them, Orion's past uncoiled like a serpent. The narrator said, from the shattered reflection stepped Cale Arden, his curse twisting tighter as he bore Calder's mark. Cale said, brother, you are bound as I am. Orion Vale shouted, I will not bow. Elena Hart said, Cale, fight it. Mara Gray cried, the mirror has made him a puppet. Jax Reed said, puppets usually have strings, so cut them. The narrator said, Cale's blade swung, but his eyes begged for mercy. Ronan Black murmured, he was not meant to fall this way. The narrator said, truth struck harder than any steel. Bloodlines were the chain Calder wielded. The narrator said, the shrine cracked as if rejecting the weight of secrets. Calder's voice said, the sigil was carved into your blood by me, Orion. You were born to serve. Orion Vale cried, I was born to break you. Elena Hart said, and I will stand with him. Mara Gray said, if the truth is fire, then we burn together. Jax Reed muttered, always wanted to roast marshmallows on destiny. The narrator said, Ronan Black stepped forward, shadows peeling away to show his hidden allegiance. Ronan said, I was Calder's spy, but no longer. Silence struck sharper than betrayal. The narrator said, the shrine collapsed into ruin, leaving firelight licking broken stone. Calder said, your heart will undo you, Orion, just as it undid Cale. Orion Vale shouted, then my heart is my weapon. Elena Hart pressed close and whispered, let it be ours. Mara Gray said, the choice has found its moment. Jax Reed muttered, great, right when the roof is falling. Ronan Black said, my betrayal ends here. Calder dies by my hand or none. The narrator said, chains of blood and love coiled tighter, and the twist revealed itself. Orion's curse was also his salvation. The narrator said, the company emerged into a valley scorched by war, where bones of towers pierced the cloud. Mara Gray said, here, the price of magic was carved into stone. Orion Vale whispered, if Calder forged me, then this place was the anvil. Elena Hart touched his hand and said, then we choose what is made of you now. Jax Reed muttered, I vote for less doom, and more stew. Ronan Black said, Calder hunts faster now. He knows your heart is breaking the chains. The narrator said, Ash rose like ghosts, and the path toward the final choice sharpened. The narrator said, they reached the ruins of a citadel where statues wept blackened tears. Mara Grey said, this was once the heart of the Covenant. Orion Vale said, and now it is Calder's throne room in waiting. Elena Hart said, then let us claim it before he does. Jax Reed muttered, statues crying, walls groaning, cheerful place. Ronan Black pressed forward and said, the curse was born here, and here it must be broken. The narrator said above them, thunder rolled like drums of judgment. The narrator said, in the citadel's heart, a shattered throne burned faintly with rune fire. Orion Vale said, if this is where the curse was carved, then this is where I ended. Elena Hart said, not alone. Mara Grey warned, every end births a cost. Jax Reed said, I knew I should have stayed home with Stu. Ronan Black stepped beside Orion and said, if you fall, I will not watch without fighting. The narrator said, the air grew thick, as if the stones themselves held their breath for what was coming. The narrator said, the ground cracked as Calder strode into the hall, silver mask gleaming. Calder said, you are the weapon and the chain. Deny it, and you deny yourself. Orion Vale said, then I deny you. Elena Hart stepped forward and said, love is stronger than your command. Mara Grey raised her staff, sparks leaping. Jax Reed muttered, and here comes the part where everything breaks. Ronan Black growled, then let us break him first. The narrator said, the throne flared alive, fire casting every shadow into war. The narrator said, the hall shook as chains of fire erupted, binding stone and air. Calder said, submit, and the pain ends. Orion Vale roared, pain forged me, and now it frees me. Elena Hart cried, you are not his, you are ours. Mara Grey chanted an incantation that split the fire. Jax Reed fired his slingbow into the blaze and said, never liked chains anyway. Ronan Black charged with blade raised. The narrator said, the first sparks of the final war ignited in the ruins, and destiny roared to life. The narrator said, the citadel quaked, as Calder drew chains of flame into a storm above. Orion Vale shouted, your curse ends here. Calder said, it was never a curse, it was your birthright. Elena Hart pressed close and said, then we break it together. Mara Grey raised her staff, summoning light against the inferno. Jax Reed muttered, if anyone survives, I expect applause. Ronan Black charged forward and said, this ends with my blade or my blood. The narrator said, the hall split open, unleashing the climax of fate and fire. The narrator said, chains lashed downward as Cale Arden staggered back into the battle, veins alight with corrupted fire. Cale cried, Orion, finish me before I become him. Orion Vale shouted, no, I will free you. Elena Hart said, then free him through love, not death. Mara Grey warned, the curse takes faster than mercy heals. Jax Reed muttered, no pressure, just save the world and your cursed friend. The narrator said, Cale's blade clashed with Orion's, sparks showering as brotherhood and betrayal collided. The narrator said, Cale Arden fell to one knee, gasping as Orion Vale's sigil burned through the cursed veins. Cale whispered, forgive me, brother. Orion said, live free or die free. Elena Hart cried, do not let him go to darkness. Mara Grey said, redemption can wound as deeply as corruption. Jax Reed muttered, someone owes me a drink if this works. Ronan Black shouted, Calder weakens, strike him now. The narrator said, the chains faltered, the storm above flickering like a dying sun. The narrator said, Calder tore away his mask, revealing a face carved with scars and power. Calder roared, I gave you strength, Orion. You spit on your maker. Orion Vale shouted, you chained me to darkness. I choose light. Elena Hart said, and I choose him. Mara Grey whispered, the final seal breaks now. Jax Reed muttered, well, there goes my survival plan. Ronan Black cried, then fight for what matters. The narrator said, the hall blazed as Calder unleashed his full wrath, a storm of steel and sorcery. The narrator said, the battle roared into its peak as stone shattered and fire chains split the sky. Calder cried, you will break as Kale broke. Orion Vale shouted, no, I rise where you fall. Elena Hart gripped his hand and said, together always. Mara Grey cried, now, bind him with your choice. Jax Reed muttered, please let this work before I'm roasted. Ronan Black leapt with blade, striking into Calder's guard. The narrator said, Orion unleashed the sigils' full fury, love turning curse into salvation, and the world cracked with light. The narrator said, the citadel lay in ruins, smoke curling into a sky torn open by light. Orion Vale fell to one knee, the sigil flickering dim as if emptied of fury. Elena Hart knelt beside him and said, you chose love, and it saved us. Mara Grey whispered, the curse is undone, but the cost is written in his body. Jax Reed said, well, at least we're alive, mostly. Ronan Black leaned on his blade and muttered, the war isn't over, but Calder is. The narrator said, ash fell like snow, soft and heavy with sorrow and relief. The narrator said, they carried Kale Arden's body from the fire, his face peaceful at last. Orion Vale said, he was more than his curse. Elena Hart whispered, he was love and sorrow both. Mara Grey traced a rune of release and said, may his spirit find the light denied him. Jax Reed muttered, I never knew him, but I'll drink to him anyway. Ronan Black turned away, shadows heavy, and said, he was not the only one Calder stole. The narrator said, grief bent their shoulders, but unity kept their steps unbroken. The narrator said, by nightfall, they reached the valley's edge where stars crowned the broken horizon. Orion Vale said, the curse no longer binds me, yet the weight remains. Elena Hart said, then let me carry it with you. Mara Grey said, love is no shield, but it is a torch. Jax Reed muttered, as long as the torch lights the way to a warm inn, I'm in. Ronan Black said, the kingdom will come hunting for the one who killed their master. The narrator said, their journey was not done, but hope had a shape now. The narrator said, they camped beside a river whose waters shimmered with firefly light. Orion Vale whispered, I never thought I could be free. Elena Hart said, freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of love. Mara Grey smiled faintly and said, for once, I agree with the young. Jax Reed said finally, someone said it, love beats curses and maybe even bad cooking. Ronan Black muttered, freedom is fleeting, guard it well. The narrator said, the river's song wove their grief into a lullaby, fragile but alive. The narrator said at dawn, the ruins of the citadel lay far behind, yet its echo lingered in every heart. Orion Vale said, I am no longer bound by his chains. Elena Hart clasped his hand and said, then let us write a future unbound. Mara Grey said, the road will wound you again, but now you walk it as yourselves. Jax Reed grinned and said, and if destiny disagrees, we'll fight it together. Ronan Black said, this fight isn't over, but neither are we. The narrator said, as the sun rose, love and loss braided into a single promise, unforgettable and eternal.